Hey, I'm Guy Powell, and welcome to the next episode of the backstory on the Shroud of Turin. If you haven't already done so, please visit guypowell.com and sign up for more episodes. I am the author of the book The Only Witness, which is a Christian historical fiction tracing a possible history of the Shroud over the last 2 millennia. Today, however, we're speaking with Jim Bertrand, and he is a longtime researcher and speaker on the Shroud and its history, and especially in the area covering the image and a whole bunch of other really good stuff. And I'm really looking forward to speaking to him today. Again, we've spoken probably about a year ago,
Yeah.
and it was very informative. And he was actually one of my first interviews that I had done on the Shroud. So, Jim, welcome, and so good to have you.
Well, thank you, Guy. I think what we can give your audience today is perhaps some lesser known things about the Shroud they hadn't heard about. For instance, whether you're watching this as an expert or a novice or somebody in between, we're going to cover some things new for you in terms of, wow, I didn't know about that. I didn't hear that. For example, the Shroud left Turin in the 20th century for a period of time. What was that all about? We could answer the question, have there been any miracles associated with the Shroud? Several other items, and we'll finish up with some open questions about the Shroud. So I think it will be time well spent for people to stay tuned here and pick up some things perhaps they didn't know about.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, it's so good to have you. And so let's get started. What do you want to start? You want to go right to the screen share?
Sure. Let's go ahead and do that then.
All right.
Okay. Well, by 1937, the Nazis had shown some interest in acquiring the Shroud, and they were in turn they're asking questions about the Shroud, and we know that Hitler, when he came to Austria in 1938, acquired the Spear of Destiny, supposedly Longinus' spear that was stored there in Austria, and so Pope Pius XII was considering how he could protect the Shroud, and so they were considering where should we put it if this war starts, and they were considering the royal palace in Rome, which is where I believe the king of Italy was at the time, or the Vatican, or even Monte Cassino, which is further south in Italy. And fortunately, they didn't try any of those three because those were very much, in harm's way. But when it comes to the Shroud during those war years, they were also concerned about it from bombing. So great secrecy was taken to remove it from Turin to hide it in the Benedictine Abbey of Montevergine. Montevergine is about 20 miles, excuse me, about 12 miles from Avellino. And of course, the war started on September 1st, 1939. And on September 7th, that was when the Shroud left Turin. And only four people knew about this in Turin and Italy in general. That was the Pope himself, of course, and King Emmanuel III, who was the last of the Savoys that owned the Shroud at that time. He had been king since about 1900. Here we are 40 years later. And then his Secretary of State and also Montini. Those were the four at the giving end that knew about it. And when it was received at the Benedictine Abbey in Montevergine, only three individuals knew. And that was the abbot and the porter and one other of the monks there, because they were concerned that they didn't want as many to know about it in case one of them should die. They didn't want it to be lost forever as well. So this picture shows us where the Shroud was hidden from 1939 until 1946. And I always think it's best to use sources that are as closest to the event. For example, you won't find this on Wikipedia. This was written around 1950. As you can see, it's written in Italian down there. Here's the English translation for you. This was the side altar where the Shroud was kept during those war years, and it was quietly kept there until 1943. Been there for about 4 years when the Nazis came looking for it, and they showed up at 11 o'clock at night. And of course, the Shroud was hidden in this side altar in the church there where the monks lived. And they're searching the chapel, and the abbot had the presence of mind to get the monks together, and they prayed around this side altar. And after they'd searched the entire place, couldn't find it, the commandant of the Nazis saw them all praying, and he said, well, we'll leave them alone there. I will not disturb them. And so they left. And so that was very fortunate. And a couple weeks later, the first American Jeep arrived at the Abbey, but of course, it was still kept a secret there. All right.
Mm.
The same week, the Nazis were in northern Italy in Turin looking for the shroud and couldn't find it there. So it's a good thing that it was hidden here, and it's a good thing that it wasn't taken to Monte Cassino because Monte Cassino was heavily bombed in the war as well. Well,
So
when the war was
is
ended,
that the sorry, Jim, is that the casket right there where it's in that piece in the middle?
yeah, it's not in a casket there. That is just what it normally looks like. The
Ah,
shroud is actually hidden underneath there in a little passageway that's hidden underneath. It's very concealed so that no one
okay.
would suspect it being there. So we can't see the shroud there. But
Hmm.
the shroud was put on display just before it came back. Now, King Emmanuel had given the throne to his son, Umberto II, in May of 1946, because in a couple of weeks, the Italians are going to vote for a new form of government. And so he was passing it on to his son in hopes that the monarchy would continue. But it didn't. The Italians voted
Mm.
for a new form of government. And so his son, Umberto II, gave permission for the shroud. He went to the Cardinal Fossati of Turin, instructing him to bring the shroud back now to Turin. And just before they brought it back, it was put on public display there for about 10 or 15 minutes. These are the monks that had lived there all those years, not knowing, except three of them, not knowing that the shroud was there in their possession.
Mm.
And it was brought back in those coming days after that. Here it is being put into the casket that it was kept in at the time, and they're carrying it down the stairs there in Turin, or excuse me, in Montevergine on its way back to Turin.
Mm.
And so this was one of those backstories, you could call it, of the shroud that perhaps, many people weren't aware of. But the shroud did leave uh, Turin for during those war years, and only a handful of people knew about it. And it survived the war that way.
It's so fascinating, a story like that first of all, that it survived and the Nazis didn't get a hold of it. And then secondly, that backstory of it being hidden there, and then the story within the church and the praying and what have you. And now, and I don't know if you know this, but the reading that I've done is that when the new Constitution was passed, with King Umberto, so the King Emmanuel, he had been a kind of very friendly with Mussolini, and so the public sentiment was that we're not going to maintain the monarchy because he was such a friend of Mussolini, and
Mhm.
so then he was trying to get his son to be the king afterwards, and so that's why he was named king, and he was like only king for about 3 or 4 months, as I recall.
Even less than that, because he was officially passed on in May of 1946 that he was the new king, and they had their referendum in June.
Hmm.
So it might have taken some weeks after that before all of the paperwork was done. But basically, the Italians were ready for a change, and so he went to Portugal and
Mm.
lived out his final year. Actually, he left for Portugal in June of 1946.
Yeah,
So that's
yeah,
the backstory on that.
yeah, and it's also interesting that the new Constitution then took all of the possessions from the royal family. And because this was in their possession, technically this now became owned by the Italian government. But because it was a religious thing and they wanted to have separation of church and state as best as possible, they never actually took possession of it. They left it in Turin and left it under the auspices of the church.
Yeah, yeah, very interesting there, Guy. I'm glad you can appreciate that as well, the history that it went through there. Most
Yeah,
people don't know that.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So sorry, I'm
No,
adding
that's
some stuff
okay.
you probably already knew.
And I apologize to our viewers that the quality of that picture might seem very low, but this is the benefit of going back into history
Yeah,
because
yeah.
you go to a Wikipedia for something, you're going to get a third or fourth or fifth generation story that's been passed on. Whereas this is from the people who lived at that time. And I think we get more accuracy by going to those original documents than we do
Mm.
from by going decades afterwards.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wikipedia is good for some things, but it has some problems with others.
Right, right. Well, let's move on to the second item we're going to talk about, and that is, have there been any miracles associated with the shroud? And the short answer is there have been no physical miracles that have been confirmed because of the shroud. However, there was a miracle associated with the Holy Face. And this was another original story that came from the 50s. It was a 10-page article. It was very well done. And I was able to summarize it in about 3 or 4 paragraphs here. And this is a story of Josie. And let's go to Josie here. It's not giving me a forward here. There we go. There's Josie. This was a small girl that was born in England in 1945. Her name is Josephine Woolham. And when she was 5, she developed osteomyelitis, which is an acute inflammation of the bone marrow, and it spread throughout her whole body. By the time she was 10, her left leg was 8 inches shorter than her right. And if you look in that picture, you see that the
Mm.
difference in feet there because the osteomyelitis went across a growth plate. And when your growth plate is disrupted during those growth years, your limbs don't turn out to be the same length. And so she was really down physically and mentally. By age 10, she was down to 42 pounds.
Mm.
And, Guy, I don't know how much I weighed when I was 10, but I'm sure it was more than 42 pounds. And she was hospitalized and given the last rites in 1955. And about this time, her father brought home a magazine that had featured an article by Captain Leonard Cheshire of the Royal Air Force in which he wrote about the shroud. And someone from his office sent the mother a picture of the Holy Face, something like this. Okay, so Josie's mother received this picture of the Holy Face, and she set it on the mantle above her fireplace and prayed. And later that hour, the hospital called and said, "You will see a great change in Josie." And so the mother, rushed off to the hospital expecting the worst. And when she got there, Josie was up and about, wheeling about in a wheelchair. And the doctor said she was completely healed from her osteomyelitis. And he further stated, I quote, "This cannot be explained scientifically," end quote. So this was a healing from praying to the Holy Face picture. But the story doesn't end there. So Josie's mother then sent a request to Captain Cheshire expressing Josie's desire to have a relic of the shroud. Who does that? I want a relic of the shroud. Well, after much effort, he arranged to have the shroud brought out for her. He got permission from King Umberto II to have it brought out. And he and Josie made the trip from England over into, it took days because she was not very medically in a very good condition. But they brought her into Turin, and here he is pushing her. This is the Royal Air Force captain pushing Josie into the cathedral. She's wearing her first communion dress, by the way.
Mm.
All right. And they draped the shroud across her lap. All
Mm.
right. So Josie held on to the shroud. They took it out of the case and draped it across her lap. And she was expecting her withered leg to be like the other one, but nothing happened. And upon returning, she did notice, however, a change in her outlook on life when her mother met her on the return trip, picking her up there at the bus stop afterwards. She asked her, "Josie, what did you receive?" And Josie replied, "More than I went to ask for." And she later had that left leg amputated when she was 21. And she got a job as a telephone operator. Back in the day when you and I were growing up, they had telephone operators. She met Ray Jones in 1968, and they were married. Unfortunately, the first child died before age 1 in 1970, but following that, she had a boy in 1973 that did survive. And in an interview, she stated, "Something changed for me in Turin. Something was given to me that day, a grace to face the daily troubles of living. I am happy and content, and that has stayed with me every day since," end quote. And she died from a lung ailment in 1981. And so I guess the message there is that perhaps it's the spiritual miracles and the conversions that are maybe more of a reason for the shroud than physical ones.
Yeah, yeah, what a story. And it's amazing that she actually was able to have the shroud wrapped around her. That's a very rare case. It's just hard to believe.
Hmm. Yeah. So
Yeah, what a
well,
story.
anyway, that answers the question. Have there been any miracles associated? Not physical ones, but I know of numerous conversions
Mm.
of people who were skeptical or atheistic, and after seeing the shroud, they were convinced that there really is a God, and that this really is Jesus. So the
Mm.
spiritual conversions are happening. You can see them many times on podcasts if you read the comments that people write, or in the chat boxes over on the side, and people bring these stories out, even though they may not be well known, that it is happening.
Mm. That is such a, powerful story for the power of prayer, the power of Jesus and of God, and wow, that thank you for sharing that.
Sure, I think she was able to do more good by pushing through with the trials in life rather than having that instantaneous physical cure.
Mm.
So God's plans are different than ours, but they're always better, right?
That is very true.
Well, the next slide I want to move on to is something that your audience has some familiarity with, and that was the carbon dating of 1988. And perhaps it'd be more correct to refer to this as radiometric analysis. When they take a sample and they're analyzing how much carbon 12 do they have to
Yep,
carbon 14,
yep.
you can get an accurate count on that, but that doesn't necessarily tell the age if there's been, any contamination issues, because carbon dating is still used in the industry, but some items are more susceptible to contamination than others. And it just so happens that linen is one of those. All right. And I want to share something here with you that people have heard about the protocol violations. And here are the 15 protocol violations. The statistician Philippe Boursier de Carbone, coincidentally named Carbone, he lists the 15 points. And I'll pause here for a few seconds to let people glance over in that. Maybe they haven't seen these before.
Yeah, the it is pretty impressive. I guess we can go ahead and read a couple of them. I think that'd be
Well, I
not
would
all
just
of
say
them, but a couple of them.
looking at the number five in a double blind test. These three labs are supposed to be looking at some control samples and the shroud sample, and they weren't supposed to know what was what, but they could not obtain a 3-in-1 herringbone control sample. So all of them knew just exactly what they were looking at. So number five, this was not a double blind test, all right?
I
And
think though, that one, I think they could have actually gotten they could have blinded the materials because they could have unraveled it and then, kind of scrunched it all up or something like that, and then done that with the placebo or the test and the control. I think they could have done something like that because in the end, they're going to take those samples and they're going to burn them anyway. So it didn't matter that they were, whether they were still woven or not. They could have somehow, scrunched them up or taken the individual threads and unwound them. And then, like I said, somehow. So, it's amazing to me that they didn't do something like that.
yeah. And if we look at number seven, actually in 1984 and 85, Dr. Jackson, who had led the STURP team, had probably the more experience than anyone in the world, had actually proposed a series of 24 other tests to do on the shroud. And long story short, there was maneuvering done to exclude the STURP team and later on exclude some labs which are now out of business. And only the three labs that were allowed are still in business today. Here's the other violation there. At number
Mm.
nine, you look at that. You're
Well,
not
that
supposed
on the number
to
seven,
have
though,
communicating. Go
yeah,
ahead.
Jim, sorry, going back to number seven. Yeah, there was, and I always push Joe's book here. I have it on my desk because but the 1988 carbon 14, what is it? The Shroud of Turin, a stunning example, dating of the Shroud of Turin, and this book is just fascinating on all of the different politics and everything, and the fact that they left, that they excluded the American scientists who had the most exposure to it and knew it so well, and I think they would have forced that, the sampling and the protocols, they would have forced that the protocols would have been totally followed. And now, just as an another aside, so Joe Marino, he's been working through various archives of Ray Rogers and Diniger and some of the other ones, and he's finding letters in there that are just astounding. And he puts out this letter called the From the Stera Archives, and some of the things that he's found relate directly to the carbon 14 testing. It's just fascinating.
Yeah, and I can share a link here coming up with that people can refer to if they want to explore that what you're just talking about there as well. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
So, moving along there, here's the rest of them. These labs were not supposed to be communicating about, what did you get? What did I get? What did they get? That's what number 9 addresses. And number 13, as early as 1989, when it was published in Nature magazine, there was an Italian engineer, Ernesto Bernati, who was looking at what they had published in there, saying you haven't got the correct chi-square value. You've got some rounding problems in there. That is unacceptable deviation. And
Mm.
he was vindicated in 2017, 2019 when the real data came out. So just kind of a long story short, if people want to freeze that and take a picture of it, look it on their own, they can later. But there were a lot of violations. So moving along from that, I was able to obtain 2 slides from Michael Kowalski, who is the editor of the British Society for the Turin Shroud. And people shouldn't be intimidated by this, because with just these 2 slides, I think we can show you what the numbers were, and people can really understand, oh, that is why that carbon test was unacceptable. Okay. Now, of course, you can see here, there's Arizona, Zurich, Switzerland there. Can you see the arrow I'm using here?
Yes.
Okay, great. So those were the labs, of course, and there's the shroud sample. Control 1, 2, and 3, those were the samples that were given in addition to the shroud, so that the labs could compare and calibrate, are we doing this correctly? And of course, the 3 controls are very close. This means 1,995 years old. Okay. And this means 646 years old. So that's what those dates mean there. A great variation among here compared to these. These are very close. These are further apart. And then down below where it says X squared value, that's the Greek letter chi. The chi-square value is where when your expected data doesn't always match up with your actual data. And so you plug it into a probability chart, right? And that chart will tell you what percent of the time what might we expect this type of deviation, right? Now the chi-square value shows 6.4 there, which would happen about 5% of the time. That's 1 out of 20. You'd expect those kinds of deviations. And believe it or not, that is considered acceptable. That's where you draw the line. If there's a 1 out of 20 chance of something happening, that's considered acceptable. But if that number is less than 5, if it's less than 5%, then that's considered significant deviation. And that means there must be some other variables that are causing this discrepancy, right? And if you look over here, the chi-square values are very low, right? That's because these all matched up really nice. The shroud is much higher and therefore a lower percentage. Now, the problem is, this is not the actual data. What did the actual data was? What did the machine say? What did the carbon dating machine say? That raw data was not published. And so Tristan Casabianca sued the British Museum of Natural History in 2017. And by the Freedom of Information law, they had to show the data from the 3 labs. It was 700 pages. And this is what it really was. And I think this is very enlightening for people if they haven't seen this. In red, we're crossing out. That was an error. It should have been plus or minus 17 years. Doesn't look like much, but it adds up. And likewise, the Oxford sample, that was an error. And we go to the Zurich sample, it was acceptable. Now, when you plug in these new numbers on the average weighted means, now the chi-square value has changed from 6.4 to 8.5. That's a great difference. And what's the percentage of that happening? 1.43. And Ernesto Bernardi was saying in 1989, he had about a 1% chance, really. And this is what Tristan Casabianca and Emanuela Marinelli and a host of statisticians determined. So this is what you would call the actual data. And in the world of science, when that significant level is less than 5%, that is considered significant deviation and it's thrown out. And this happens about 20% of the time. So my point here is that objectively speaking, the 1988 carbon dating results in the shroud showed significant deviation and they are invalid. And so in the scientific world, it's not an issue anymore, but I don't think this was shared with the general public. So I hope that those people that have seen these last 2 slides can understand now that, oh, we know something now that wasn't known in 1989. And that
Well,
is,
yeah,
yeah,
one thing as I've been investigating this is that this Nature magazine, in order to get published in Nature magazine, it has to be peer reviewed. So basically, the paper is sent out by the magazine. So the publisher, the writers of the article send the article into Nature, Nature magazine, as I understand it, sends it out to peer reviewers. They sent it out to 22 or 23 peer reviewers. They all came back and said, yep, the article looks great, and I approve or whatever. Now, sometimes they'll come back and say, please change this or please change that. But the fascinating part about that process is that the reviewers don't actually get access to the data. The
Yeah.
data is not shown to them. So what I find fascinating and troubling is that when you get something peer reviewed, the reviewers don't even get to see the data to actually make sure you did the math right or did the statistics right. And in this case, all of those red lines and all of those changes that you have there then are what the peer reviewers were not able to do because they didn't have the data.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of a fascinating subject. It's a sore subject among all of us
Yeah.
shroud authenticists. And but then that also leads to your point about this was a study in radiometry. It was not a study in dating. So tell us what you meant by that.
Well, a radiometric analysis will analyze a sample to give you the ratio of carbon-12 to carbon-14 atoms. The more carbon-14, the younger it is, not just in a nutshell. And it can do that accurately. However, if there's been some type of extraneous carbon added to it or other variables affecting that in a contaminated way, then that ratio doesn't reflect the true age of it. And to give you the reliability of this, Emanuela and her colleagues working on this, when we published this in 2019 with Tristan Casabianca, there was 700 pages of data that came from those three labs. And after analyzing it and coming up with these numbers that you see here and publishing it, that was 5 years ago in 2019. And in the last 5 years, Emanuela says there has not been one challenge to their conclusions that people are seeing on the screen right now. 2 + 3 is 5, and you just can't argue with that. And so there's just no persistence in terms of people trying to uphold that carbon dating test to being valid because they can't challenge those numbers.
Yeah. And which then means to me is that the labs actually did count, most likely they counted correctly that ratio of carbon-14 to carbon-12. They probably did that right, but that ratio, because of the potential corruption of the samples, or potentially some of the other neutron theories and what have you, it doesn't mean that that number can be translated into the age of the sample. And that is the critical piece. I think the labs actually did their work okay, but what they didn't do was then be able to take this radiometric analysis and really translate that accurately into the age of the shroud. And that's then really where I think the main problem is with that article and then with the radiocarbon dating.
Yeah, and I read a paper by Robert Rucker where he actually said that these samples were cut into 16 pieces
Mm,
and only recorded the data from 12 of them.
mm.
Because some were averaged and put together to make it look like one reading. And that basically eliminates the range, so to speak, to get it within that range of acceptability. And Robert Rucker wrote extensively on this. So although they may have taken the samples to read them, there was more than 12 pieces that were analyzed, but they didn't show up like that.
Yeah,
Okay.
and some of the other, and I don't know, we're getting maybe way off, but some of the other things that had to do with those 12 samples is that the systematic bias in there was such that if you drew a straight line, at some point you'd have the date of the shroud at some point in the future. And
Well, that's what I'm
it
getting to next, to
oh,
this next slide
sorry
here.
about that. Go for it.
There was a statistical slope that was significant. Here's the bottom corner there on there by the right foot. And that area that I'm circling right now could fit inside a 3x5 card. Okay. But in this, looking at the new data, it showed that the slope was such that every inch it was getting 91 to 97 years younger. And so imagine I've got a 4-inch thread, and this end is from the year 1000. Oh, this end is from the year 1400. How could that thread be all of those ages? So clearly it was not, representative of the true age of that. And so that is another part of discrepancy that I think a lot of people didn't realize it would date thousands of years into the future by the time you extrapolate that out to the center of the shroud where it's moving there. So there are a lot of things more we could talk about, but we'll move along here. And the next question would be in what would be the reason then why there were the discrepancies between these three labs? And we don't know for sure. The three have been proposed. Robert Rucker from Washington State believes it was a neutron flux. John Jackson believes they had to do something with the carbon monoxide levels back then compared to today and how it was stored near the ground, perhaps. And Joseph Marino has spoken about the reweave hypothesis. And so all three of those have been published, but we can't say with certainty what caused that discrepancy. So is another carbon dating test going to give us an accurate age? And the answer is, well, that's not guaranteed because something happened to the shroud after that. There was a fire on April 11th, 1997, which just happened to be Good Friday. And there's Mario Trematore, the fireman, pounding through the glass, bulletproof, bullet-resistant glass. Took him a long time. And after midnight on Holy Saturday, they rushed the shroud out. And the fire didn't do any damage to the shroud. But after that, when they put it in another container, that container was laced with thymol. Thymol is has a antibacterial quality to it, and its chemical formula is C10H14O. And so the shroud was enriched in a new carbon environment after that fire until they put it in the new aluminum reliquary. And so if we tried to date the shroud now, if that thymol environment had affected the threads, it might show up to be 17th century for all we know. So there's really not any advantage to do another carbon dating test if we can't explain why there was discrepancy in the first place and did that thymol environment affect it, right? However, there have been some modern tests, and here are three of them for you, right? The first one up there, and by the way, these are explained in Professor Giulia Fanti's book in 2015. Okay, comes from that IR that you see up there stands for infrared. And down here at the bottom, of course, is time. I think everybody recognizes there's 1000 BC, there's 500 AD, there's 1500 AD. It's got a big range, an infrared test that would test the ages. And by the way, they obtained samples from museums and private collections that have been well preserved in dry environments and calibrated the infrared age of those, and then saw where does the shroud fit in, okay? So this was a controlled experiment, well done. The Raman spectroscope also tested the shroud. It has a wide range. And there's a third test in here, which Fanti developed this fascinating instrument for, in which you pull the thread apart and you measure the tension, how much force is required to break that thread. Imagine the sensitivity of that instrument, and it has it in here. But do you see where these overlap? All three of those modern tests, which are not as susceptible to contamination, they put it in the first century. So my point here is that by themselves, these have a wide range. But if you consider all three of these tests, it probably gives us a more accurate age of the shroud coming from somewhere in the first century. And of course, all of our viewers and yourself have probably heard about the latest one that actually happened in 2022 and made the news in 2024, the wide-angle X-ray scatter. And that fourth test also agrees with these. And so, I'm not sure that another carbon dating test is really needed or if it would serve any purpose. So I wanted to share those numbers with people so they could see for themselves just why carbon dating alone does not answer all the questions for this.
Yeah, and it's unfortunate because, up until that period, the carbon dating was, considered the gold standard of dating. And that's then, I think, why, there was so much news around it. And then when it came out with this unusual or unexpected date, that really set the research and enthusiasm and understanding of the shroud back by 20 years. And it was only then now recently, and especially with the FOIA request from Tristan Casabianca, that we now have the real data. And we can actually see that not only did they do the math wrong, but they also did the process wrong and the protocols wrong. And so that in reality, all of us, if you're even a non-shroudy, I think we need to really throw out that radiocarbon dating from 1988, just throw that out as being invalid and move on and look at testing and dating mechanisms like this.
Yeah. Yeah. And if we compare the studies done on the shroud, the one done in 1978 was done so well. It was very transparent. They took a great deal of time, published it, all the data was out there. And it took 3 years before they wrote their final statement on it. And to this day, that remains the most comprehensive data
Mm.
gathering we had on the shroud. But then the carbon dating of 1988, Fiasco, and then there was another one in 2002 called the Restoration Project. And this was done very covertly. Basically, a handful of Europeans were able to convince the Archbishop that they needed to intervene, otherwise the image might be lost. And what you see on the left, that is the picture that Barry Schwartz took in 1978 of the shroud. And if you look down in that corner, all right, the carbon dating test hadn't taken place yet. So that piece there that's dark, not from a fire, but dark from handling, is still in place. Now go over here to the new one. After 2002, that piece is gone, see? But in long story short, what they did was they took the patches off, and then they took it off the old backing, which is put on this. The shroud was laid on the backing in 1534 when the nuns did the repair job. They put on a new backing from Michel Fleury Lemberg. I understand this is a 1950 backing. And then they vacuumed it. And look what happened to it. Can you see it changing size? In vacuuming it, not only did they lose a lot of archaeological location data, but it loosened the threads up. So the shroud got 3 inches longer. And that's why sometimes you'll see what appear to be contradictions in the size of the shroud. On the left, it was 14 feet, 3 inches long, if we extend it. On the right, after 2002, it was 14 feet, 6 inches long. And so some people say after 2002 that, oh, the Jesus is now 6 feet tall. Well, he was 5 feet 10 on the original shroud here. And after they did this intervention, it looks like he's closer to 6 feet. So Jesus didn't get 2 inches longer, but the shroud did get 3 inches longer. It also got 2 inches wider because it was 3 feet 7 and now it's 3 feet 9. So you have two different dimensions given on the shroud depending on what paper you're reading, right? So I wanted to share that with people because sometimes if they see those differences, they'll wonder where does that come from, and now where do they go with that? And something else that's been forgotten is that the STURP report. You go back to the original document, and these three facts I'm going to share with people. This is good science. This has withstood the test of time and intense scrutiny. I mean, these were made 40 years ago, and the STURP team stated this: there's no stuff to make up that image. Something has yellowed it, some type of dehydration process perhaps, but nothing's been added to it that could make a picture, nothing that we are aware of, right? So there's no stuff to make up the image, right? And for that reason, and for many others, as you know as well, Guy, the superficiality, the 3D information, all that, we can't prove it's Jesus, but we've proven, and Barry used this word many times too, this is not the work of an artist because we can't replicate it today. And finally, this is not a natural process to account for the totality of that image because there have been, I understand, thousands of mummies and other persons dug up that were wrapped. None of them leave an image, and especially a precise, clear image that we see on the shroud. So my point is that when people want to, some of your viewers speak with others about this, you don't have to set it up as a debate. You just simply state these three facts, and these three facts have withstood the test of time. And I think if you can share the facts, that the facts will speak themselves. And sometimes after my talks, people come up and say, they're not asking, is it authentic? They're saying, how could it not be authentic? And that is actually probably the better question.
Yeah, exactly. And this is a great way to summarize it. And
Sure.
yeah, that by 1981, those STURP scientists, as I recall, wrote like 31 peer-reviewed articles on all of their findings. And so, to your point, that STURP study from 1978 was probably the most comprehensive study of the shroud. And these are the key bullets that came out. And I think the second one is the one that, that I think is probably the strongest, is that the image is not the work of an artist. It is not the work of an artist. And
It's not the work of
so,
human hands.
yeah,
In a
not
way.
the work of human hands. That's
Sure.
exactly right.
Right. Well, the next point I want to move on to is people perhaps have heard about the travertine aragonite soil that's found in the Jerusalem area and on the steps of the temple. Actually, they're still there. The temple was destroyed in 70 AD, but that soil is found on the famous south entrance to the temple that was destroyed.
Mm.
And however, there's something that goes beyond that, and that is this type of limestone, right? The travertine aragonite you see there. Many times it's elements and minerals are found mixed with other things. And this one happens to be found with strontium. Strontium is an element on the periodic table, and it's found in a very specific ratio. For example, if you look at the limestone strontium composition here and compare it to someplace 20 miles away, it'll be different. All right. And I learned this from Father Mitch Pacwa. And speaking with him, there was an atheist scientist back in the 1980s, and she was studying the shroud, and she was an expert in these types of studies they did with the limestone. She found that the limestone strontium signature that a spectrograph will give for the soil on the shroud matches the limestone strontium signature found in the edicule, the tomb of Jesus. All right, in Jerusalem, there's a church called the Holy Sepulchre, and in that there is an edicule, the area of the stone that was Jesus's tomb, and the strontium there, limestone match, goes to the shroud. And so this is pretty good, compelling proof that the shroud was once in the tomb of Christ. That doesn't prove the resurrection, but it certainly proves that this shroud came from the tomb of Christ. Who else would it be but him?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And
Yeah.
it is so fascinating, things like that now get it right back to the to that tomb, and not, by the way, to the garden tomb. It gets it to the tomb there in the Holy Sepulchre. So
Yeah, and if some of your viewers want to check on that, they could do a search very easily. Just search Shroud plus Jim Bertrand plus EWTN. And Father Mitch Pacwa hosted me on his program there, and he's the one that explains this. And there's a 55-minute program there that we did where this is explained in more detail, and they can get the details on that if they want to look into that. Well, next, moving right along here, we've just got a couple items left. We've covered a lot of ground here. Hopefully, the viewers have seen some new things, and there's more to come here. For your viewers, there's probably one of the top researchers in the world is Professor Emanuela Marinelli. And she had this 30-page paper she did way back in 2012, and it's found at shroud.com. And basically, it was a summary of what was said before, during, and after the carbon dating test. And I read this paper 3 times. It's an easy read, about 15 pages of it. Half of it is footnotes and references. And it contains some of those things you mentioned in Joe's book, which is 800 pages for people that really want to get into it that way. But my point is that it's been researched very well, and we know more now than we knew then about that. And so people are welcome to check that out. And speaking of the Shroud research, our friend Joe Marino has looked into every scientific paper published in the last 130 years, over 1,100 of them. And he was able to come up with over some 102 scientific disciplines have been involved in studying the shroud. And you just don't find that anywhere else. You might find, on King Tut, there might have been 20 or 30 different disciplines involved. But this is 102 different disciplines. And I'm just showing you the beginning of his paper because it goes alphabetical. And there's 102 of them. That's really, really quite a lot. And in these 1,100 papers that Joe examined, he classified them were they showing data that challenged the authenticity or supported it. And in the scientific world, by an 8-to-1 margin, the data supports authenticity. So this is not a 50-50 debate in the scientific world. According to the work that Joe has done, it's an 8-to-1 margin. So it is really very, very convincing and compelling.
yeah, that is fascinating. And 8-to-1 is probably also not probably not the case if you take the radiocarbon dating out of it. They would probably be even higher than 8-to-1.
Yeah. Well, I got a couple more I want to share with you here.
Yeah,
People
we've got a couple of minutes, so maybe one more and then go from there.
Yeah. Well, this is what the shroud looks. The shroud is being stored in that aluminum reliquary after 2002. It's filled with argon and it's no longer folded up. and it's in the chapel at the Basilica of St. John the Baptist there in Turin, Italy, as we speak today. And many people have open questions about we still don't know what was that route from Jerusalem to Constantinople. Those have been talked about. What was the route from Constantinople to Lille, France? What caused the carbon dating problems? How was the image formed, and things like that. And so these are, it's okay to have differences of opinions on these and explore these, because we don't have all the answers to these questions, but they don't really challenge the authenticity of it. Dr. Jack Marquardt has it arriving in Constantinople in 574, but you're also aware that Ian Wilson has it going through Edessa and arriving there in 944. So, which of those is it? That's an open question. That's one of those questions. And of course, there's at least three different major routes that it could have taken in that route. We don't hear about it. The great interest in that area. Where did the nail go in? Well, Pierre Barbet suggested down there by the desktop spot. Frederick Zugby has it closer to the base there. Which was it? Does it really matter? And we don't know for certain, although Barbet seems to be the more popular, well-known one, but both of those are open questions. For people that want to know more, this is my contact information. I wouldn't call this a business card, because this is not a business for me. When I go to give talks, as I've done the last 10 years, I've never made a dime from this. They cover my expenses. And if they make any other donations, those go to the Turin Shroud Center in Colorado to support the research that Dr. John Jackson does. So that's how they could contact me. And there's your friend and mine, Barry. And that kind of wraps it up in terms of what I wanted to cover with you, Guy. And boy, we finished well under time. Is there anything else you want to say?
Yeah, there's a million things I'd like to say, but that was fantastic. I definitely learned some new things. I liked the miracle that you showed early on with now what was the girl's name? Was
Josie Woolham.
Josie Willem.
Hold
And
it,
then
yeah.
I liked
You take it off
this
screen share. I'm gonna stop screen share right now. Is
yeah,
that okay? And
and I
that way,
liked your story on the shroud going to Montevirgine, and that is kind of fascinating because, to your point, it was one of the only times, at least recently, that it left Turin. I don't know if it left Turin early on, when it was brought there, I guess, what, 500 years ago. Did it? I wonder if it left there early on for various exhibitions or
well,
not.
Joe
I
Marino
don't.
has a nice history on that. It actually traveled to Turin before 1578,
Hmm.
and then it came back again. It
Yeah, yeah,
went for good in 1578. It was held up for public displays of the royal
right.
weddings, things like that. But there might be some parts of history that we may never know about it. But Joe's got a
Yeah.
nice 30-page summary of the 500-year history after 1578.
Mm. Well, and before that, when it was in Lire, and as it was moving from Lire down to Chambéry, it
Right?
apparently went through quite a few areas in southern France as well. There's some documented areas that it traveled for different exhibitions before it was owned then by the Turin by the Savoy family.
Hmm.
So yeah, very fascinating. I mean, that it's always, I love doing these interviews, and I'm so glad we were able to get this one scheduled. And every time I do learn something new, and so I appreciate that. And your presentation is very well put together, and it's like I said, it's great to learn something new every time.
Well, thank you, Guy. I appreciate you reaching out to me, and I hope that this has supplemented people's knowledge so that they know more now than they knew an hour ago. And if that's done, then mission accomplished. And
Yeah,
there's more to come.
absolutely.
There's more to
Absolutely.
come.
Well, that's part of our I think our overall mission is how to not only do research on the shroud, but also to educate and help others learn about the shroud and what it can mean for us, and the history of it, and potentially that and hopefully come up with the question, how can it not be the authentic burial shroud of Jesus Christ?
And even deeper on that, on a philosophical level, um, if God has left us the shroud, what does He expect our response to be? Does He want it to be indifference,
Mm,
or if He's left it to us for a reason? How should we consider that to respond in a way that would be pleasing to God?
yeah, yeah, exactly, exactly. Well, Jim, thank you so much. I appreciate it. It was, like I said, it was fascinating and everything, and just an awesome discussion on what was going on and what some of the new findings are that you have, and go from there. I did want to bring up one thing, and that is for those of you that are very interested in St. Louis coming up at the end of July of next year. There will be a 3-day conference. And if you're interested in that, please go to shroud2025conference.com, shroud2025conference.com, and there'll be information on there, and some of the final details are being worked out. We're very close to having the final speakers done and everything. And so we're looking forward to it. It's the first conference in quite a few years in the US, and certainly the first conference on the Shroud since COVID. And it'll be very fascinating to finally get to meet people that I haven't met before. I've only met them virtually, and now I'll get to actually meet them face to face. And so that'll be very exciting for me. And if you're, you as in the audience, if you're interested, please go to shroud2025conference.com. So,
Yeah,
Jim, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
sure. Well, I would just simply add to that by saying to people that I think their registration's open in January, and it's only going to hold like 160, Joe Marino told me. So they may want to register early because it's going to fill up. Okay.
Thank you for that. Yes,
They've
it
got,
is
like you
going to
say,
fill
40
up. We're
speakers already
actually,
lined up.
yep, we're actually looking for a potentially a different location that will allow us to have more, because I think we're going to have actually more than 150. I think
Yeah.
there's going to be quite a good turnout and demand for people to learn more and more about the Shroud. And so definitely looking forward to that. So
More
anyway,
than
for the audience, thank you, and please stay tuned for other videos in this series of the backstory on the Shroud of Turin. And please visit as well, guypowell.com, and sign up for more episodes. And if you like this one, please rate it with 5 stars. Jim, thank you so much. It was wonderful speaking with you.
God bless you, Guy. Thank you.
Thank you.